So the New York Times, the U.S. newspaper of record, has finally addressed the Nord Stream sabotage incident where on September 22nd, 2022, a series of clandestine attacks destroyed the main gas pipeline between Russia and Europe. Fingers were immediately pointed on both sides, with the West blaming Russia for blowing up its own pipeline, while Russia hinted that the West was surely to blame. And Russia has continually called for relevant officials, for example, from Norway, who conducted an inspection, to come clean about their investigations. But now the New York Times says, based on anonymous intelligence tips, that the likely suspect is pro-Ukrainian groups, which they hint as being private individuals that are either likely Ukrainian or Russian nationals. The paper said that this was the first major breakthrough in this case, even though that isn't true, since legendary journalist Seymour Hersh gave his own account that was extremely detailed based on anonymous intelligence officials that pinned the blame on the US government itself. Now, given the sophistication of this attack and all the resources that went into it, everyone at the beginning assumed that it had to have been a state actor. And that was the reason for all of the finger pointing, plus the fact that former Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski literally tweeted, "Thank you, USA," with a picture of the blown up pipeline and promptly deleted it. For its part, Ukraine swiftly denied any involvement in the attack for posterity. So this all begs the question, who really blew up Nord Stream? And was it a private organization with seemingly unlimited resources, or was it a state actor, such as the United States government? So my first question is for you, Igor. So when you hear that a pro-Ukraine group apparently blew up Nord Stream, as a Ukrainian citizen yourself, what do you think about hearing this from the New York Times?
That it's a two takes from me on this one. First of all, I not only reading the New York Times, I also listening to Kremlin official speeches. And yesterday I was listening to President Putin saying it's a joke how that task to blow on a 200 meters down pipeline need a government support and the resources supported by government, because it's technically very complex. The second, if we're talking about the group what can carry on this task in Ukraine, yes, Ukrainians has that kind of groups what training a lot of time. And you know what, during the time of when Crimea was Ukrainian part, in the Sevastopol they have the underwater diversant, for diversion committed underwater special school when they can train divers. But the deep length, like a 200 meters, it's over their limits. That's impossible. So my first take was questioning why Seymour Hersh released this this article what we all read, and why everybody after that following and making the controversial statements about that. There's something fishy here. I still don't find what is fishy, but it's not completely clear for me. I believe that story will be developed further.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mark, you're in Moscow. I want to get your insight about what's going on in Moscow in reaction to this story. And, I think that's quite understandable, since it's an important Russian asset that got destroyed with no justice. Now, we've seen there's been no official investigation, or at least there has been, but it hasn't been released by relevant officials yet. What is the reaction now from Moscow after the New York Times piece?
Well, of course, Russia has simply mocked this obvious bit of obfuscation and misdirection. Obviously, this pipelines, which cost Russia and numerous European energy majors, not just German. It has to be said that numerous European state energy companies were heavily invested in the Nord Stream pipeline. It cost tens of billions of dollars, and everything has been lost, not only for Russia and Germany, but for multiple European countries. The depth that this was conducted at, these pipelines are not like the pipelines that go into your house, right? They are a serious thickness of steel. The pipelines are then completely surrounded on the sea floor by steel reinforced concrete, which would have had to have been penetrated. And the explosives were placed at significant distances apart. This is something that would have taken a professional state team hours to do. And you have to remember that the Baltic Sea is a NATO lake for all intents and purposes. It is one of the most surveilled bodies of water in the world, if not the most valuable. The U.S. story is not at all credible. We've seen pictures of the Andromeda yacht from Der Spiegel that was supposedly involved in it. To think that it could have contained the thousands of pounds equivalent worth of explosives, equipment necessary to penetrate through the concrete, decompression chamber to provide the suitable diving conditions. It's fabulous, right? It's not even a credible story. I'm frankly shocked. I think the U.S. would have been able to come up with a more credible bit of misdirection than this. I think the question is, most importantly, this story is simply not serious. But what does the Russian government do after this? What is the Russian government's response? Obviously, there will be no investigation. There will be no repercussions. The new German government that is in power never wanted the pipeline built and is perfectly fine with this, offering up to their hegemonic master. And how Russia will respond to it is probably best understood in that NATO has issued new directives to increase security of undersea cables and pipelines amongst all their members, because the precedent is now set and a quid pro quo is the most standard response to something of this sort. So we now live in a world where undersea pipelines, cables are fair game.
So Ben, the New York Times, it said that what the information it had was the first, credible source leading to what happened to Nord Stream. Now, you being an investigative reporter, what do you think about the New York Times completely, almost ignoring completely Seymour Hersh's slam dunk story that seemed to completely give a credible explanation for what happened?
Well, the New York Times is basically a U.S. government mouthpiece. In fact, the New York Times confirmed a few years ago that when it has a story that could be sensitive to U.S. national security, in scare quotes, that the New York Times always informs the U.S. government beforehand to see if there's anything objectionable in the story. And if there is, the New York Times obediently removes it. The New York Times confirmed that on its official Twitter account. So even if it's not officially U.S. government state media, it obediently toes U.S. government propaganda lines. And in attacking and trying to delegitimize Seymour Hersh, it's continuing a long trend in the New York Times. Let's not forget, Seymour Hersh is a Pulitzer Prize winner. That's as mainstream as it gets for a journalist. He has published in the past in mainstream newspapers, also the Washington Post and such. And the fact that he is now being smeared, and the fact that he even had to publish this article at his own, blog on Substack, it reflects the fact that the U.S. corporate media has become so censorial. It has become so tightly controlled. No dissent is allowed, even if it's factual. And I do have to say that there's only one thing about the New York Times story that I agree with. It was a pro-Ukrainian group that blew up the pipeline. The U.S. government is a pro-Ukrainian group. And the U.S. government has a long history of carrying out these kinds of attacks on civilian infrastructure. I'm in Nicaragua right now, where I'm speaking to you all from. In the 1980s, the people of Nicaragua were very familiar with the terror campaign that the CIA waged against civilian infrastructure, blowing up pipelines, putting mines in the ports in Nicaragua. The International Court of Justice found the U.S. government guilty for crimes against humanity for those war crimes committed against Nicaragua. Of course, the U.S. government never paid the billions of dollars in reparations it legally owes Nicaragua for carrying out those acts of terrorism. There are many other examples. I mean, we don't need to go back 30 years. We don't need to go back to the 1980s. We can even look more recently at what the U.S. has been doing to Venezuela in attacks on civilian infrastructure, or the Stuxnet virus that the U.S. Created along with Israel to destroy civilian infrastructure in Iran. I mean, there are many examples of this. So the U.S. blowing up a pipeline would not be new. It would not be unprecedented in U.S. history. Seymour Hersh has reported on this. Many others have reported on it. The New York Times acts as though they don't exist because the New York Times is simply acting as a stenographer for the U.S. government.
Igor, I'd like to just get your reaction to what Ben just said. I mean, do you think that it's completely credible that the United States would actually have carried out the attack on Nord Stream?
You know what? Working in investigative journalism, you need to deliver some evidences. And if a possibility of United States government do this, yes, technically speaking, it's capable. It's practically few of also governments capable, like United Kingdom is capable, and other governments is capable. But do we have that evidence to point the finger? Yeah, we have only the motive. Motive is very simple. It's a money. Because to Russians, to blow that pipe, that's completely out of touch with reality, because that pipe deliver a good, sustainable revenue influx to Russian Gazprom and to Russian government. So to blow in that pipe by Russians, that's a ridiculous idea. And they was immediately blamed for that. So we can exclude Russia out of equation. And who's left? Can Germany do this? I think no. But can some forces in Germany do this? I believe that the Green Party, who was advocating against Nord Stream 1 and 2, and who was not happy with that pipeline, yes, they can. Can Zelensky government do this? Yes, but they probably not capable to do this. So I believe this is some kind of game when the independent or look like independent actor can be delivered by help with the government. Because the people in Langley and people in the who accomplished like a Fort Detrick or other schools and West Point, they very skillful to invent some kind of the conspiracy. So they planning conspiracy, but they not leading any evidences to the public. So I believe that's a little bit more complicated than this in a same article. But I'm 100% sure that United States interest behind of this act of terror.
Mark, a lot of the analysts that I've seen on Twitter, a lot of these think tank blob folks, I've seen them kind of say that, something along the lines of, well, if it's who I think it is, the name that's being thrown around, this could be a pretty big story. It kind of seems like they're setting somebody up. They're going to have a fall guy for this, and it's going to be some kind of, Scooby-Doo villain reveal, right? What do you think about that?
Yeah, there's obviously a sacrificial goat, and to be quite honest, if the U.S. would have carried through with this, they would have provided at least one, if not several, potential cover stories like this. And they've obviously been hinting that it is that their cartoon narrative of what happened is a Ukrainian oligarch. There were reports in the New York Times that this individual's name has already supposedly been passed around various intelligence agencies. Sorry, it was the Wall Street Journal. And they went even further and said that he, like some James Bond villain, left a signature calling card.
Yeah, exactly. And they're saying that it could have been some Russian or Ukrainian national.
Yeah. What I have heard is that it has even gone further behind, the obvious of a Ukrainian oligarch, and some people are starting to already definitively point the finger at the former quote unquote president of the U.S.-backed putsch regime in Ukraine, Poroshenko, the candy oligarch, who has fallen afoul of the Zelensky regime, being charged with treason by them, and then basically being skirted away and, falling out of line with everyone. So there's every possibility that he could be the one set up as the fall guy to paper over, at least publicly, the relationship between Germany and the United States.
Ben, same question to you. What do you think about how it looks like they're setting up a fall guy, and there's just going to be one individual rather than some kind of organization or state responsible for this?
This is the modus operandi. This is exactly what they do every single time when a story like this is exposed. I mean, this represents their desperation, and it's because Seymour Hersh's story is so obviously correct. I mean, not only considering his proven track record, every single time Seymour Hersh publishes a major report, the U.S. government denies it and claims it's false, and it's proven to be true. You can go back to the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. You can go back to his exposure of the U.S. use of torture in Iraq at Abu Ghraib and other prisons. He has been proven correct again and again and again. And the U.S. response is at first to deny and say it's false. And then when it's proven to be correct, they obfuscate and blame a sacrificial lamb and try to skirt the attention away from the fact that they have a documented history of doing this repeatedly. And I mean, there is a lot of evidence, not only in the story that Seymour Hersh reported, but the fact that, I mean, many people had reported on this even before Seymour Hersh reported. I had a report noting the NATO military exercises that happened in the Baltic Sea right before the Nord Stream explosion just a few months before. And furthermore, I mean, we have so many U.S. government officials openly gloating about the destruction of the pipeline, including the third in command of the State Department, Victoria Nuland, the main architect of the 2014 coup in Ukraine, including the CIA director turned State Department spokesman, Ned Price, including the Secretary of State himself, Antony Blinken. All of them publicly boasted of the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. And there's, of course, President Joe Biden himself, who said that if Russia militarily entered Ukraine, that the U.S. would make sure that there would be no Nord Stream. It would not exist. And then a German journalist asked President Biden in this press conference, how can you make this happen? This is a German pipeline, not only a Russian, it's a German pipeline. And Biden said to her, believe me, we have ways of doing it. I mean, they're publicly boasting of having done this. And honestly, the New York Times expects us to ignore all of that and act as if some Ukrainian oligarch, as if he had no ties to the United States or intelligence agencies, would have the technical capabilities of carrying this out. I mean, that is the actual crazy conspiracy theory, is the narrative that we're supposed to believe from the New York Times and the U.S. government.
Igor, now you have quite a familiarity with militant groups in Ukraine. Do you think that it could have been, some group in Ukraine, some rogue group, some militant group that went off and did this?
Yeah, it's a good question because, first of all, as was mentioned before, that was a big exercisement called Baltic Tiger, and was accidentally started in the 20th of September. So, and the German ships was involved, and they trained in protecting critical naval and air force infrastructure. So practically, they can do this if they have a divers on a boat. And I believe that Germany can be involved somehow, not on the level of government, but on the level of the people who want to do this. Talking about the Poroshenko, he have enough stupidity in his mind but we don't need to understand. We need to remember that Poroshenko was involved in some business a trading call with the independent rebel republic during his tenure in the power. So he's an oligarch first and the president second. And we need to understand that Zelensky is the actor first and the president second. He's playing the president very well, but he is not a statesman. So he don't understand everything. So I believe this is a great story, but this is just a beginning, because we have obviously lack of evidences, and the governments of Denmark, in whose territorial waters that accident happened, just recently declined the Russian request to investigate. And also I want to say one important thing. One, what's mentioned by President Putin 2 days ago. The Gazprom, who was allowed to observe the pipe, they deployed a ship, and they find out in a few miles from the place, they find out some artificial construction on the bottom, close to the pipeline, and it can be like like an antenna to transmit signal underwater, because for underwater transmission you need a special kind of radio communication. So I believe that the place of crime, place of this act of terror need to be investigated. And everybody who against that, they providing the cover up for perpetrators.
Mark, do you think that Moscow has any, card up its sleeve to actually force any of these countries to reveal what they know about the fate of Nord Stream?
No, I don't think so. I think that this will be one of these stories like Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, that at some point the truth may generally be accepted, but there will never be any, a credible accounting for it. There will never be an investigation that will open the doors, and it will never be permanently put to bed. But the U.S. has long been opposed. They attempted to kill the pipeline via sanctions. They promised to do so, sanctioning not just Russian companies but European companies as well. The U.S. has a history. Actually, in the 1980s, under President Ronald Reagan, the U.S. sabotaged a Siberian oil pipeline, causing what was the largest fire in human history that could be seen from space. There was a book written, interestingly, in the 1980s called Ally versus Ally, talking about the problems of a then Soviet supplied energy pipelines to Europe, and how the U.S. regarded that as a geopolitical threat. The author of that book was a then young Antony J. Blinken, who Seymour Hersh identifies as one of the principal conspirators pushing for. I don't actually agree that this is an act of terrorism. This is an act of war. And I think that needs to be considered very seriously where we are now, with the recent bringing down of an American drone just off the Sevastopol naval base, where previously U.S. proxy forces have conducted multiple drone attacks. We are this close to an active hot war between NATO and Russia, and every incident that has led up to this, like the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, Russia has up until this point shown incredible restraint, but that restraint cannot last forever.
Mark, that's a really good point, saying that we are close to a hot war, because, of course, me living here in Prague, in the Czech Republic, within the European Union, it's very obvious to us, I think, that we are at war. We have a war economy now. We have massive inflation while we're sending weapons to Ukraine. The same thing happened in the United States to a lesser extent. Inflation here, the last report said it was over 16%. Czech people are deeply upset with what's going on. Ben, just final comment from you about this whole situation and what Mark said about the potential bombing of Nord Stream being an act of war and not necessarily an act of terrorism.
The German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, said it very clearly, an exact quote: "We are at war with Russia." That's what she said at the Council of Europe earlier this year. And of course, the German people never voted for a war. The people of Europe never voted for a war, but the ruling class of Europe is waging a war on Russia, and the United States is leading them in this NATO proxy war against Russia. It's not really new. You could say it goes back maybe 2014, maybe even earlier, but it is a proxy war. And of course, the US also wants to wage a proxy war against China as well. And it's very clear why. The United States is trying to maintain its unipolar imperial hegemony over the entire planet, full spectrum dominance. It's the Wolfowitz doctrine. There can be no near peer strategic competitors. I mean, every single major US imperial strategist spelled this out clearly in the 1990s, the peak of the unipolar era. Former Secretary of State and former National Security Advisor Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, wrote in his book, The Grand Chessboard, that the biggest threat for the United States would be an alliance between China and Russia and potentially Iran. And that's exactly what we do see. And he said that the US had to do everything it can to prevent them from unifying in a strategic alliance against US hegemony. And that's why the US is so desperate in this moment. The US goal is very clear. The president himself said it in a speech in Poland. Biden said that they want to overthrow Vladimir Putin. The foreign minister of Canada, Melanie Joly, she just said the same exact thing this past week. She said, our goal is regime change. She said regime change. They want to overthrow the Russian government. They want to install a puppet government like they had in the early 1990s, which, of course, was a period in which millions of Russians died in the neoliberal shock therapy imposed on Russia by the United States. And also the defense secretary of the U.S., Lloyd Austin, former member of the board of Raytheon, we know what economic interests he serves of the military-industrial complex, he said the U.S. goal is to weaken Russia. So, I mean, for me, it's cut and dry. This is part of a larger proxy war, larger hybrid war. The real danger is that it will escalate further. You know, the downing of this U.S. drone, it definitely could be a dangerous sign. And in fact, the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has publicly said that this could escalate into a direct conventional war between NATO and Russia. So they're saying it. And I think we should do everything we can to prevent that. But unfortunately, the reality is that the United States has made it clear it is not going to accept a peaceful resolution. And Josep Borrell, the head of EU foreign policy, said that the only end to this conflict is a military solution. So they're willing to have World War III in order to try to save their precious empire and try to destabilize Russia and, by extension, China.
All right. Well, thank you, guys. We're going to leave it there. You've kind of alluded to our topic for next week, so I think that's a good place to cut it off. Gentlemen, thank you so much. That's it. Hey, everybody. If you like this content, please smash that like button. Consider giving it a share. Please subscribe. It's just one button to press. And also, if you feel so inclined, please subscribe to our Patreon to support the page. Anything is appreciated. And we thank you so much for viewing this. And we'll get back to you next week. Thanks a lot.